It started with a yard sale. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just killing time on a quiet Saturday morning. My wife and kid were visiting her parents, and the house felt too silent. So, when I saw a cluster of tables covered in knickknacks and old furniture on the corner of Willow Street, I pulled over. The couple hosting the sale were elderly, their yard brimming with random odds and ends. As I browsed, my eyes locked onto an old, ornate mirror leaning against a faded wooden chair. Its frame was heavy and intricately carved with strange symbols, almost like runes. The glass itself had a faint, smoky tint, giving it an eerie, antique charm. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the old man said, startling me. His voice was raspy, and his pale blue eyes seemed to pierce through me. "It belonged to my late wife. She used to say it showed her things no one else could see." I chuckled nervously. "Sounds interesting. How much?" "Take it," he said quickly, his tone almost desperate. "I just want it gone." I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I loaded it into my car, not thinking much of it. Later that afternoon, I set it up in my home office, leaning it against the wall opposite my desk. That's when things began to feel off. The first time I noticed something strange, I was working late. I glanced at the mirror and saw a faint shadow dart across its surface. My heart skipped a beat, but when I turned around, the room was empty. I brushed it off as fatigue and went to bed. Over the next few days, the occurrences became harder to ignore. The mirror seemed to hum faintly, almost imperceptibly, whenever I was alone with it. At night, I would catch glimpses of movement in its reflection, shapes that didn't belong to anything in the room. My wife noticed nothing when she returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then came the whispers. They started soft, like the rustle of leaves, but grew louder the longer I sat near the mirror. I couldn't make out the words, but they felt sharp, like they were meant for me. One night, while I was working, the whispers grew into a deafening roar. The lights flickered, and the room felt impossibly cold. I stared into the mirror, paralyzed, as a handprint appeared on the glass from the inside. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The handprint faded, but the glass now reflected something impossible. My office, but with me missing from the image. Instead, a dark figure stood in the center of the room, its head tilting as if it were studying me. Terrified, I covered the mirror with a blanket and shoved it into the garage. I wanted to get rid of it, but every time I tried, something stopped me. A flat tire, a sudden illness, or an inexplicable bout of forgetfulness. It was as if the mirror didn't want to leave. The final straw came a week later. My son, only 5 years old, wandered into the garage while I was in the kitchen. I heard him scream, a sound that froze my blood. I sprinted to the garage to find him standing in front of the mirror, the blanket crumpled on the floor. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't him. The figure in the mirror wore his face, but its eyes were black voids, and its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. I grabbed him and ran inside, locking the garage door behind me. That night, I smashed the mirror with a hammer, each swing releasing a guttural howl that echoed through the house. The glass shattered, but the pieces didn't fall. Instead, they dissolved into a fine, black mist that vanished into the air. I haven't seen the mirror since, but strange things still happen in the house. Shadows move where they shouldn't. Whispers creep into the edges of my hearing. And sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection lingering just a second too long in any shiny surface, its grin unnervingly wide. The yard sale couple? I went back to Willow Street to find them, hoping for answers. The house was abandoned, its windows boarded up, and the yard overgrown. A neighbor told me the couple had died years ago. I don't know what I brought into my home that day, but I'm certain of one thing. It didn't leave when the mirror broke. It started with a simple desire to clean out the garage. My wife, Emma, and I decided to host a yard sale on a chilly Saturday morning. We'd been clearing out old furniture, knickknacks, and items we hadn't used in years. Among the clutter, a heavy, ornate clock caught my attention. A dusty antique we'd found years ago in a flea market. It never worked, but Emma had insisted on keeping it because of its vintage charm. The clock was the first thing to sell. A wiry, older man in a faded trench coat bought it within minutes of arriving. He barely glanced at the other items, his pale hands shaking as he handed me a $20 bill. "You should be careful with this," he muttered, his voice gravelly. "It's not just a clock." Before I could ask what he meant, he grabbed the clock and disappeared down the street. The rest of the day was uneventful. Typical haggling over prices, friendly neighbors stopping by. But as the sun began to set, Emma noticed something strange. The clock was back. It sat on the corner of the table, its brass face gleaming in the dim light. "Didn't you sell that?" Emma asked, her voice tight. "I did," I replied, my stomach churning. I searched the yard, expecting to see the old man lurking, but he was nowhere in sight. We packed up quickly, bringing the remaining items inside. The clock, though unwelcome, came with us. Something about it made leaving it outside feel wrong. That night, I woke to a rhythmic ticking sound. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The clock hadn't worked in years. But as I stepped into the hallway, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. The clock was sitting on the kitchen counter. Its hands spun wildly, faster than any clock should. I reached out to stop it, but the moment I touched the brass frame, a searing pain shot through my hand. I yanked it back, staring in horror at the fresh burn mark, a perfect outline of the clock's face. Emma screamed from the bedroom. I sprinted back to find her sitting upright, trembling. "There was someone here," she whispered, "a man standing at the foot of the bed. He had the clock in his hands." I searched the entire house, every room, every closet, but there was no sign of an intruder. The doors were locked, the windows secured. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, I tried to get rid of the clock. I threw it in the trash, drove it to a dump, even left it on the curb with a sign that said, "Free." But every time it came back. By evening, it was sitting on the mantel, as if it had always belonged there. That night, the dreams started. In them, I saw the old man who had bought the clock. He stood in a dark room, surrounded by hundreds of clocks, each one ticking out of sync. His face was hollow, his eyes black pits, and he kept whispering, "It's your turn." Emma and I tried everything, burning it, smashing it, even calling a priest. Nothing worked. The priest, pale and visibly shaken, refused to come back after stepping into our home. The clock grew louder, its ticking invading every moment of silence. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and objects began to shift on their own. Emma started waking up with scratches on her arms, and I began hearing whispers, soft, insistent voices calling my name. Last night, I woke to find myself standing in front of the clock, my fingers tracing its brass frame. His hands were still spinning, but now they were moving backward. The whispers were louder, more insistent. I could feel the pull, like it wanted me to do something, but I didn't know what. This morning, Emma and our daughter, Lily, left to stay with her parents. I don't blame them. The clock is still here, ticking louder than ever. I tried to leave with them, but the moment I stepped outside, I felt an unbearable weight on my chest, forcing me back inside. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever see an old brass clock at a yard sale, no matter how charming it looks, don't buy it. Don't even touch it, because I can feel it now, watching me, waiting. And I think tonight it's going to tell me what it wants.